Thank you, everyone, for joining us today. Very first thing I would like to be able to do, despite it not being its usual beautiful sunny self outside and all the rain, certainly acknowledge the traditional lands that we have the privilege of working on as members of the Royal Roads University community. And just to give a little bit of thought, ask each of you to give a little bit of thought about what that means to you. In terms of appreciation and recognizing all that has come before us. So certainly want to make acknowledgement to that. So today we are here to Kyla and Dranna and I to share the findings of a small research study that we did in 2017, actually, carried out through the fall of 2017 into 2018. And we wanted to look at specifically student engagement, online graduate student engagement. So in my role then as program head of the Masters of Arts in Higher Education Administration and Leadership, and coming from a student affairs background as a leader practitioner, it was really important to me to practice what we preach here around scholar practitioner approaches, and that meant to conducting a study like this. So I reached out to Kyla and Dranna, and they were most keen to partner with me on in this small study. When we talked about what is it that we want to do, how can we make best use of this time and this study, we talked a lot about our different perceptions and experiences around understanding student engagement. And coming from, each of us have had opportunity to either attend or be part of what one would consider a more traditional campus in terms of being on site and having a vibrant campus student community active face-to-face. Student engagement, we can talk quite freely about that, particularly coming from a student affairs background. What does that mean? What does that look like? What does the research say? But we gave a lot of thought to, well, what does it mean when you're in a primarily online university, a blended learning environment? And what research has been conducted in looking specifically at online and specifically graduate students, recognizing that there is a difference in age there. Oops, sorry, I forgot to change my slide. So we know that there is, in fact, actually very little Canadian research on online graduate student engagement. What does it mean? What does it look like? How does an institution know that it's doing well or not? In fact, what's happened, as per many of services and supports and approaches to teaching and learning in an online environment, in the absence of having something specifically prescribed for an online learning environment, we've taken more often than not what existed on a face-to-face traditional campus, and we've tried to morph it in to an online environment. And in some cases that works, and in other cases there might be other ways to do things. So we're quite interested in looking at that. So when we also talked about, okay, there's very little for us to highlight around, particularly in Canadian research on online student engagement, what as faculty, what as leaders, as practitioners is informing our practice when we talk about and develop and deliver online graduate learners student engagement? What's informing our practice then? How do we know if we're doing what we're supposed to be doing? Hence the study. I apologize, there's a lot of text on this slide. So just to give you an overview very quickly in what exists currently or what some of the thoughts are around online student engagement, quite often we break it down. We think, okay, well, what does online mean? What is happening in the online learning environment? And a couple of the things that are realities that we know to be true about an online learning environment is that it has definitely grown quite rapidly in the last few decades. We've moved, even our terminology has moved from, what used to be considered distance education. I don't know, anybody here participate back when you had to mail in your, yeah, me too. Yeah, I completed my bachelor's of social work here in Victoria at UVic, but in the blended model. So back then it was big binders came in the mail, modules, and you sent your paper and you waited for your paper to come back. So we know that that's not our reality today. We also know that online, quite often, when we talk about it, we're thinking of that virtual learning environment, that virtual presence. We know that particularly at Royal Roads, we pride ourselves on blended learning programming, which I think more and more institutions across Canada are looking at. And we also know the benefits of that. There's indeed literature, and our own experience would speak to the increased access, the convenience of online learning world for students particularly, and it very much reflects our technological reality in all that we do. If you were to stop then and say, okay, well, let's look at online and now let's look at student engagement, you will find an abundance of research. And for the most part, if you trace it back, it was in the 1930s that it first started to bubble up. You'll see that Ralph Tyler's work is quite frequently referred to as somebody that drew attention to the value, the significance of what a learner does in addition to what he's learning and what the teacher does. So that presence, that level of engagement started to be talked about, started to research. We also know there is oodles and oodles of research now that talks about a positive correlation between student engagement and student success, so persistence. We know that the more engaged a student is, the more probable of his or her success. Academically, personally, that engagement, they need to be present. For anybody that's ever worked with first-year students, that's usually our first line. It's get involved with whatever that looks like for you, get involved. And it's all about engagement. A more recent article in 2018 by, I want to say Gracia, I think, draws attention to online student engagement specifically and recognizes that it's still very vital. We know that it's still very vital to student success, and that there needs to be more research, more understanding in what it means to have changed the physicality of that engagement, to have moved it to an online learning environment. He also goes on to talk about he proposes a bit of a multi-dimensional model. So in terms of thinking of student engagement, and we had talked about this as we put together our survey, well, what are we talking about? Are we talking about just the engagement online in the Moodle shell and the course shell? Are we talking about engagement in terms of the relationships that they are or are not expecting to have with faculty and staff? What about research? We're talking at graduate student level, so it's implied that there's some aspect of research, be it primary or secondary. What does it look like in terms of campus community, too? Because our campus community, when we throw that term around, if you go to a conference or something like that, we assume people know what we mean, and it looks very different in terms of the hubbub and the buzz of a more traditional student-driven campus community. So he proposes that, when you look at student engagement, there are multiple perspectives to consider, and the commonality between all of them tends to be the degree to which a student is actively present and is actively engaged in that relationship, be it the classroom, the campus community, the faculty, the staff. Having their needs met, their personal needs met, their academic needs met, and feeling part of their learning, their learning individually and their learning community. So we toddled off and did a what we call mixed methods, small study. Mixed methods from the perspective of the qualitative piece. We looked at the literature. As you know, there's some document analysis attached to that. We also conducted focus groups with students. The quantitative piece is we designed an online survey. And also looked quite a bit at the quantitative institutional data that existed. Now I'm going to hand it over to to you.
Thank you. Okay, so I can talk a little bit more about the nature of the study and the questions that once we looked at, again, had a lot of great conversation, the questions that we posed. So how do RRU students perceive student engagement? And RRU online graduate students, so very particular to that. Just so you know, the nature of the study, we only looked at degree programs and blended or online programs. So master's and doctorate students we reached out to for this study, and how do they perceive engagement? And then what types of supports and services do they expect from Royal Roads to support that engagement? Okay, so that's a really specific focus on their expectations around how they perceive they should be engaging with their learning experience. And then how can an institution best respond to their needs and to their expectations of student engagement? So when we know what they expect and what they think about engagement, taking that with what we know about the benefits to engaging students and with what we know about service design and delivery, how can we respond effectively to balance expectations and to support needs? So we reached out to all of our, at that time, worked with our registrar's office. We started with our, in conducting our survey, we started with an online survey that went online or digitally to all of our online or blended programs that were active during the spring. And we had a pretty significant group of students at that time. If you think about the breakdown of Royal Roads, we had at that time looking at 1,692 potential students. We had 471 responses to our online survey. So not bad, 28%. We had some incentives that we did have some gift cards that we offered as a random draw. And then within that demographic, as you can see on the pie chart on the screen, the font a little bit small, we did see a 65.5% female response rate, just over 30% male. And then we did have representation from transgender or, chose not to disclose gender in that bracket. So fairly well representative of our student body. We were actually pretty happy with the way the demographics shifted because it actually is fairly aligned to the overall breakdown demographic-wise of our online students. And similarly, in terms of the age, the majority of our students were over 40 that responded, and that fits with our what we know to be our online blended demographic. So similarly, most of them work majority being worked full-time. We had some that worked part-time. Most of them had already completed a bachelor's degree prior to engaging in the study, though not all. And the majority of them did not identify. We did have some that identified as Aboriginal or Inuit or Métis. We had some that identified as international, but it was a fairly small percentage of students in this response that did. But then that reflects a little bit of at the time where our demographics were. So this is where we get a little interactive with our crowd. We thought we'd start by asking what type of services and supports do you expect that some of these online students then were expecting from us?
Online that has a deal, let us know.
Career services? Yeah. It ran the gamut. I'm going to say it did run the gamut. Okay, so survey said, Dranna.
Never question your importance.
So the next couple of slides will show what students expected. This one pulled out specifically high expectations. So all of the respondents, they had a high expectation of the library, writing center, and new student orientation was also up there quite high. But again, it covered all the way across to probably on the other side, the food bank and religious or spiritual supports were on the low end, but there was nothing that we found that no one had any expectations of. So that was, so it was interesting to see that whether or not students were using them, there's high expectation across the board.
I have a question about this one. Was this a Likert where you gave them a list of services and then which of those would be the highest from that list provided?
In terms of so this was a Likert type scale. There's a high expectation, some expectation, or no expectation. I think it was a 3-point scale.
Yeah, I can.
Yes, and they were.
It was a prescribed list.
Thank you.
Yes, Rosie, do you have a question?
Expectation was defined as what?
So that was left to their interpretation between.
3 to 5, 4 to 5.
So this was, you chose from either you had high expectation of the service, so it was a 3 was high expectation, a 2 was some expectation, and a 1 was no expectation. And so the reason we've pulled this out, it'll become a little clearer on the next slide. This is specifically saying students said this at the highest level of expectation for services. The next slide, this has a lot of information on it. The blue now combines some expectation or a high expectation. So, for example, the library services went from at around just under 90% had a high expectation that it would be there, and now close to 100% of students had some or a high expectation of library services. And then what this data shows, there was also a question around, did you use these services either while you were in residency or use them while you were online, to get a sense of sort of use of uptake and the timing of some of that uptake. And so, as you'll see, there are some services that have I know it's kind of hard to see up there, some services where the uptake in person and online is very similar. So, and that is the library and writing services, as well as services like career enhancement services and counseling services. The uptake is similar across modalities, whether they're here in person or in an online space. And others that are a little bit more local, things like the food bank, that would only be on campus. We also shifted in this question a little bit because we didn't ask about expectations for housing and the recreation center because we were asking kind of blended it online and possibly we didn't catch it. But we did ask about use, and so we were able to see some of that as well. Is there anything you two want to add to this one? The other piece that is interesting in this table is that specific supports for groups like international students or Indigenous students that were not a high number of respondents in our survey. We had a very low number of international students and Indigenous students, but the level of expectation from the general responses saying, I have high expectations or some expectation that Rural Roads provides these services was quite high. Sort of showing that I think there was some level of student interaction with this thinking, like I'm not just thinking about the services that I expect provided for me, but these are the services that I expect to be provided broadly at the institution for the student population. So there's that note again. We also asked around, specifically around kind of that community, the development of community for students, and found that almost a quarter of respondents, 23% of respondents, do have an expectation that Rural Roads will provide online social events or activities. We didn't parse that apart in the survey around whether those are academic focused activities or like in what venue that would be, but there is a level of expectation around online socializing. And as well, that half of students expected that there would be some facility in community building. So I think in line with the way we deliver programs, there is an expectation that students are not just showing up to class online, receiving information, and then going away and doing what they will with it, that there is a community and connected piece that's happening in the online spaces.
I have a question.
Yes.
Sorry. So I'm interested to know, did you separate then the first slide that we saw with the supports with the library, writing center, etc. So those were identified as support services, and then you separated activities from that list intentionally, and was that done in a qualitative form? So here we're seeing 23% of the respondents indicated that they expected the university to provide online social events. So this is separate from what we saw earlier, which to me looked like support services. So I'm interpreting this one to be more activities, right? So you can engage in support services that touch your academic, personal, etc. And now these are activities. So my question is, did you separate these two? So separate support from activities. And if so, was this done in a qualitative form where students, you asked an open question?
Yeah, sorry. Yeah, we did have this as a specific survey question, and then I didn't probably get too far into the path because I just switched the slide over. But when we got into our focus group, so then the way we reached out to those focus groups in the survey, students were given an opportunity to be recontacted if they wanted to engage in a focus group. And then we took all of those who indicated that they would be interested and ran them through a randomizer, so with their identification number, and then randomly selected people to invite to a series of focus groups. And then again, because we had to fit around different timetables and time schedules with time zones, we didn't see as high an uptake from that randomized group as we'd hoped. So what were supposed to be focus groups sometimes turned into one-on-one interviews. But we did that approach intentionally to try to not be biased, particularly with those that we had relationships with, that we could just tap and be like, we know you like to socially connect with us. Do you want to come meet? So we were happy with the randomization of that. So within that place that we can get to in some of the themes that came up from qualitative data, yes, there were open questions about what your expectations are for social engagement outside of the prescribed curricular format. So that's a long way of saying I forgot to tell you about how we did our focus groups. And yes, we did pose that question differently in both spaces, so the qualitative survey as well as in the interviews. But the interviews were a smaller number of participants.
Did that answer your question? Yeah, this was a quantitative question. Do you expect it? I think it was a yes or no. And then we explored it more. Do you have a question, Rosie, or are you just holding the mic for us? Thank you. We appreciate your help. The other set of survey questions, sort of Likert type sales survey questions that we asked, was around access to supports and services within students' home communities. So to understand there's services that we're providing, but are students also accessing similar type supports in the community? And what we found here was that a high number of our students indicated they access library services in the community, are using recreational facilities in the community, and engaging in community committees or organizations, so engaging in things like volunteer work. And in all of that kind of mirror a pattern of what student life looks like, right? But the interesting piece, I think, are the bottom three, which is that almost 40% indicated they access coaching support within their community outside of Royal Roads. Similarly, almost 40% accessing career development support, and 35% accessing counseling support. So I think that shows that the services that were provided. There's high levels of expectations for those services on campus, but students are also accessing sort of complementary services or services already within their own community, within their own networks, in order to take advantage of some of the growth and development that happens as a student, or to help overcome barriers. Anything you guys want to add to that? No? And then in terms of themes from the qualitative data, so some of this came from open-ended questions within the survey, and some of this comes from the focus groups as well. There was a very clear message in terms of engagement being linked to the cohort model, as well as residencies and having face-to-face connection. Although in one of the focus groups, I pulled a quote that talked about the link in terms of online, how beneficial it was to get to know people online before coming to residency, and it was the link between those activities that kind of illuminated the connection. Yes, Rosie.
I might be anticipating something, but did you do a breakdown by program? When you spoke of the cohort model, it might be interesting. I don't know what your representation was by program in terms of respondents, but how it might break down between the interdisciplinary students, for example, versus the other students.
We did not parse the data. We can parse the data in that way because we did ask for program. We haven't done it yet, but certainly one of the things that came out of the focus groups, at least one of our participants was from interdisciplinary studies and talked about the extra work that it takes to create connection as an interdisciplinary studies student, because they're dropping into cohorts where there's already community, where there's already connections that have been made. And so, yeah, there is opportunity to dig deeper.
I'm sorry. I just find this so interesting. My question is, these emergent themes that are focused about engagement, how are they connected to your research questions, and which specific question are these emergent themes more fitting?
I think when we try to understand what our student expectations are for engagement, and understanding what engagement is from their perception, then understanding that they've come to have an experience that isn't the experience that Tamara was describing that she had with the binders, and that they are coming for an experience specific to. They're not. I'm using the word the co-creation or the co-collaboration, but they seem to be coming for an experience that is an engaged learning environment, but not necessarily using that language. Like there isn't that idea of Aston's theory of persistence, but more looking at, well, I expect to be able to connect with faculty and talk and dialogue and connect with staff and engage in research and practice. So that's the question, I guess. Does that help answer your question? Yeah.
And one of the pieces under that intentional development of relationships, we sort of saw two themes under that. One being an onus on Royal Roads to provide space to facilitate intentional relationships, but also a really consistent theme from students saying, being engaged in my learning means that I take ownership for my learning and I put effort in and I reach out and I create relationships. There was there was sort of a two, and sometimes they were joined in the same response. I both expect Royal Roads and I have an expectation of myself to engage. But there was certainly a theme of engagement that was a personal onus on students. Tamara, you look like you're going to say something.
Just to, I think, simply echo what you're saying, it's a great question, and I think the qualitative interviews just gave, whether it was one person or three people, however many were there, the opportunity to delve further and really try to get a sense of their expectations. And so it gets blurry in terms of what their expectations might be and what they understand student engagement to be, or how they define it. So it gets blurry between the two. So yeah, these were some of the themes that seemed to the core of the conversations very much revolved around things around the importance and significance of the cohort model, the responsiveness of the community, which again, we could unpack to see if that's more academic than perhaps personal support, and the flexibility. And I think the bigger thing too was the emphasis on the relationships. And again, every now and again, we'd have to remind ourselves, it's graduate students too. So that's another factor, which is why we looked at the degree to which people were using services in their communities and the types of services that they were using. That may not be the case for our more typical undergraduate, 17, 18, may not be as actively engaged in using their services in their community. But despite the use, it didn't seem to damper what they expected their institution to provide.
And then the other set of themes that we pulled out from the qualitative data was digging a little bit deeper in terms of what those services are that they're expecting to support their engaged learning. And so some of the specific ones that were highlighted both in conversations around I interacted with this service and it supported, it was helpful in my success, supported my learning. These were some of the ones that came up at the beginning. So the library, writing center, career services, research services, and financial aid and awards were all kind of specifically named. And then a big piece around community building and network sharing. So that came up particularly in the focus groups around people talking about the value of classmate connections and cohort mates. And, so for example, in an MBA program talking about, well, I have built my professional network as part of this program, and that's been very helpful in class and outside of class. So those themes of student-to-student connections. And then the final one, supports with technology and the learning environment. There were a number of students that talked about how beneficial having access to technologies like Collaborate has been in terms of facilitating deep connection with classmates, so that it's not just trying to get their project done, their team assignment done, that the technology is supporting them in being engaged in that. And that, then inevitably there were the stories about the challenges with technology, but at the heart of it, it was talking about things like having the cafes in Moodle, like within a course shell, having a social cafe being a support to student engagement because it was giving permission to have those sidebar conversations. And then again, with things like Skype or Collaborate, being able to see face-to-face, there was some real value that was highlighted in that.
And the other theme, and I think it's actually on a later slide, was synchronous. Like that is of value for sure, and as challenging as it can be to schedule, or as challenging as it could be to see participants attend, there still was a theme definitely that emerged of people saying the value they get, the learning and engagement they feel from synchronous learning was definitely appreciated.
And just anecdotally to what Kyla has said, teaching in the McLeod program, and I know our institutional policy around not being able to make synchronous sessions mandatory, and I get the rationale for it. I have been very pleasantly surprised, I guess, although I have to be honest, I suspected as much, that students will move mountains to get on those synchronous sessions. That's been my experience. There's apologies if they can't. They want to know so that need to connect. And more, I'm finding with the different courses I'm teaching, the uptake on the offering of, I call them virtual pub nights, for writing or checking in, or just again, the uptake is significant. So it's interesting because you think, okay, we haven't mandated it, but perhaps we don't need to. I wouldn't want to do anything, but that the expectation is there, and they have the expectation of one another too. And this is just anecdotally my own experience, but there is that sense of if other students aren't there, their classmates are looking for them, right? It's, where are you? So most interesting. You want online, they want the flexibility, they want the autonomy, but the themes just seem to come back to that sense of connectedness, belongingness, feeling cared for, being part of a community, things, support, absolutely, personal and academic, absolutely. So very high level, we started talking about, okay, so we look at so far what we've unpacked. What are some of the things that we could possibly look in terms of being applied to our to different roles? So as a faculty member, what really seems to be coming to the top is the expectation or whether it's an expectation, but the expectation for engagement and how to meet that as a faculty member, ensuring that there is more engagement than simply discussion posts, simply going in, posting. There's an expectation there that there's more. So whether that is in-depth feedback, that people get personalized feedback, check-ins, virtual, get-togethers of some significance, there seems to be a great appreciation for that level of contact. And also being able to connect, engage the students, given the focus and how the expectations around career development came up. The opportunity for students to be able to network and engage with current practitioners and leaders in their respective fields is yet another way to, okay, they've got this, expectation that this is doing something for my career, that there's something there. And so when you think of professional networking, meeting people in, the fields that they may not know, could be a way to ensure that we're meeting that need. We also talked about, in terms of an administrator, being able to recognize the investment in supports and services to be there. So something that really jumped out for all three of us, and I would probably say when I think of the study, it's the first thing that pops to mind, is the overwhelming expectation for supports that did not positively correlate to the participant representation. So the fact that there was such a high expectation that Royal Roads will offer supports for Indigenized students, yet our participant pool wasn't that. So it wasn't self-reflecting, but there's an expectation that that will be there. There's an expectation that, counseling services, even though that was identified as something that they have access to and are using in their community, is there. I think is really important because sometimes when we're assessing the, funding or the need, can we fund this program or that program or what one to cut, we quickly look at the data and look at the usage and think, oh, well, it's not being used as much as we thought, so we can cut back on that one. But it's probably worth considering the impact because, that's not necessarily its value in and of itself, is the fact that somebody isn't using the uptake on the service. There is an expectation that that service is there. And, obviously being able to allocate resources to make sure that there is a engaging and dynamic learning environment online. And then we talked about, as practitioners within student affairs, student services, being able to be mindful that services and supports that are offered to our students need to consider the fact that they're online. And primarily, we looked at graduate students, so that they're graduate students. And I think we already knew this going in, that it's much more than a cut and paste approach to taking a service like counseling and plunking it online, that there's more to do than just that. And of course, making sure that faculty and program staff, in terms of ensuring that students know what supports and services are available to them online, because again, that kind of goes back to that feeling cared for and feeling like they have access. And faculty and staff, of course, are pivotal in the student experience with helping them to connect, whether they're the providers of the supports that they're looking for or they're the person that they're reaching out to for help. So we presented this at the caucus conference, and it was very well received. A lot of head scratching too, I think, in the sense that there wasn't necessarily things that we were saying that nobody had thought of. But again, just trying to get mindset around traditional face-to-face versus online, undergraduate versus graduate. And certainly from a student affairs perspective, we talk a lot in that area around student development theory. And it's a very, it's a founding piece of all that we do. But, we started having just kind of off-the-record conversations, so to speak, about it still has great value, but does it reflect the graduate online students' needs and experiences? And then that led to conversations of adult learning theory and but I digress. Yeah, that was it in a nutshell.
Thanks for that. That was very interesting. Tamara, can I ask you, as a faculty member, if you were surprised by some of the graphical representations that you saw?
I think as a faculty member, I would say I may have been surprised that there were not more. I mean, I wasn't surprised that the priority was on the academic, like the library and the writing center and those, how do I do well in my courses? I was surprised in this environment, pleasantly and maybe of the need and the expectation that even though students are opting for a virtual or a blended and online learning experience, that the need to perhaps go above what is prescripted in an online learning shell is there. So in other words, students have an expectation that probably more so, because I've taught in person as well, when students come into a classroom, they sit, you have that exchange, you have that eye contact, you have that conversation, you're gone. And you really only hear tell if there is an issue or a problem. I found that in the online world, I think I would be doing a disservice if I treated students or treated my teaching that way, where I go into the online discussion forum, post a few things, go back and not check in, not create other opportunities for engagement, which wasn't necessarily the case face-to-face. So there's a difference there. Like face-to-face, that need is being met, right? That level of engagement is there, whether it's humor, it's relationship building, you're building it. That's not readily available to you in an online forum, so you have to work harder at it.
And I think that scales down on the support level as well. Right?
Of course.
It's very difficult, a different situation being a librarian trying to help
Of course.
a student with research in an in-person way, because you get all that feedback in terms of nonverbal cues and things like that you just don't get when a student asks,
Exactly.
I'm looking for this thing, which you always have to go, okay, they're not really looking for that thing, they're actually looking for that thing. But, making sure that you can continue to have that conversation and feed the right amount of information to keep them interested until you get them to that point is really, that's one of the big challenges from, I'm sure, every support area. And it's the same for Teresa as well. And I'm sure it's the same for counseling and other services as well.
Yeah, no, it's an excellent point, because we all know that when you're working with somebody and if you see, see tears, if you see slumped body, if you see, somebody's hurting or somebody's struggling, you'll respond. You don't see that online. You have to dig a little deeper for it. And you have to create a world within which, or a learning environment within which people feel safe to be able to say, you know what, I don't get it. And can I call you? Can we have a Skype conversation? Can we do da-da-da-da? And, the flip side of that is back in the olden days when it would be, must go to professor's door, knock on door and get answer. Well, they wouldn't be knocking on the door at 12 at night or 11:30 at night. So there's also the 24/7 piece to it, so as you well know. So yeah, I think I wasn't not bowled over by anything, but it was just kind of, okay, so that there is some validity to this. We're on to something.
I just thought I would add that one of the things that I often try and do with students when I'm talking to them is encourage them to talk to their professors. Because students who have come from a face-to-face experience assume that that isn't an option, sort of thinking very much in an office hours kind of mentality.
Yeah.
And so if students are coming in and saying, well, I don't understand about this, and I say, why don't you ask your instructor? I've actually been asked, you can do that? Like, I can ask that question? Like, you betcha you can.
And you should.
And you should. And what I then hear from students who are a little bit further on in their programs who have taken advantage of that is that they are very pleasantly surprised at how willing instructors are to answer questions, and that wasn't something that they expected, but that they're very grateful that that's there,
Yeah.
because they are able to get that information.
Yeah. It's amazing to, you know, again, more anecdotally, and I'm sure everybody can speak to this, I'm watching students find ways to connect. So what might have on a traditional campus been meeting every Tuesday at 9 at the cafe to, you know, talk, kick rocks, whatever, is turning into Slack. Like they have their own communication channels, right? Which begs the question too, sometimes we get, well, why can't we use Slack in the Moodle shell? Tamara, can't we just use Slack? Do we have to use that? And I very consciously have kept a line there because the purpose that it serves, I wouldn't be involved in a face-to-face campus in those circles, in those worlds. That's meeting other needs. I wouldn't be showing up, you know, at the pub or at the cafe, wherever they were, face to face, and saying, include me. What, you know, how do I fit in? I don't. Not for that purpose. So I intentionally keep it separate. You're most welcome to do that. Absolutely. Fill your boots. Good on ya. But the work per se, the formal learning piece, happens over here in the Moodle shell. Any other thoughts, comments, Frederick?
One of the stats that was interesting was the high expectations for counseling and then the very, very low use of counseling. And I was wondering if you had time to explore that, because it's not central to your question, but it may tell a lot as well. Maybe there's a lot of fears as students arrive older into an online program where they may expect to face more difficulties, and then that might relate to engagement too. So just wondering if it had come up in focus. And
I think we were looking probably more at that correlation though, because there's a high expectation, but then there's a lot of people using it in their community. We in the quick conversations we had, we sort of offset it with the fact that there's an expectation is there, but they're maybe not using our counselors. And then maybe what do we need to do to make sure that they are aware of how, like it did beg a question of, okay, so is it when they need it? Is it in the form that they need it? If they have an expectation that it's there, what do we need to be doing to make sure that they know they can use it? Absolutely, yeah.
One of the ones that was very high in terms of expectations was security, right? But very low use. You want it that way, though, right?
Yeah.
So, you know, it depends. I think the nature of every service is a little bit different in terms of how that might equal out in terms of expectation and use, and just to be sensitive to that in terms of the processing of the data.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. What I just wanted to add was keep in mind that the vast majority had undergraduate degrees. So there's an implied experience with services and supports. So that is another one that I would love to unpack further. And wouldn't it be fascinating to see if we broke it down where the differences were, right? For population of students that have previous experience, whether they use the services or not, they know how it rolls, with somebody coming into an online learning environment that's never had that experience in a traditional environment. What are their expectations? So.
Yeah, my comment is very linked to that. It's about career services. I was surprised to see 40% using outside career services when we have it. And I would love to see how you unpack that, because maybe it is just that they're unaware that we offer those services, because not all plans out there cover career services. So it might be costly for people, and coaching, you know. So it would be interesting to see, is there something we should do on our end to make sure people know that these services are available?
Yeah, it's an excellent question. And sometimes people assume that the only way a service can be delivered is face-to-face. And that's not the reality.
They might also be qualifying LinkedIn as a career service, too.
True.
Right? So if that's what
Yep.
version of using services in the community is, that's very different than what career services would be at the university.
Yeah.
Right.
Right, you are. No, go ahead.
I like to say that I find this data are quite useful for our program because we have a lot of online programs that were wrote, and a lot of this data I find it's very useful for us to develop our online program orientation, because sometimes we assume students have certain needs, but it's always good to find that they what kind of services they really need and also in what kind of like in depth. So I do find some like the way that you guys look into the detail, like the data in details, can provide a lot of help in tailor these services into our programs.
Thanks.
I guess it's coming to me.
Absolutely.
I actually don't have a question. I just have a comment. And it's just, I just find this really fascinating because as I was sitting listening to this, it brought me back to my first experience as a distance educator. I was a correspondence educator. Yeah. I used to mail those packages and receive them and mark them. What I think is so interesting is the whole take on engagement, because within the face-to-face environment, we often think of engagement within the walls of that room that we sit in. And what online education has done is it has revealed to us the importance of a holistic approach to engagement within an educational environment, right? Yeah. I never thought of my students of all the other stuff that they were doing, like taking swimming lessons, being in cadets, and all these things when I was in the classroom. In fact, I didn't know half the stuff that went on when they left, right? Yeah. When I got into that online environment, or distance environment, I then realized, like, oh my gosh, there's so much going on, and the connectedness of community and all those pieces. So I just think this is fascinating work.
Oh, good.
Thank
I'm
you.
glad. Oh, you're most welcome. Thank you for being so interested. That's an excellent. Quick. Goodbye. Thank you guys very much for coming. It means a lot to us to have the support and the interest. Very much appreciated.